Good evening, Space Coast. Welcome to our live coverage of the 2018 election results here on WEFS and at FloridaToday.com. I'm Isadora Rangel with Florida Today, and tonight I'm going to be your host moderating a roundtable with some of our top political insiders and experts in Brevard County. We're going to go over the results of the governor's race, of the U.S. Senate race, all those 12 amendments on the ballot that got everyone confused, as well as the top races here in Brevard County. It's shortly after 7 p.m. Polls have just closed, and we're going to see the results starting to come in very shortly. Joining me tonight are Chris Muro. He is a political science professor at Eastern Florida State College. Republican Catherine Rudloff. She is the executive director of Business Voice PAC. And Democrat Kendall Moore. He's a lawyer in Brevard County and a former candidate for county commission. Thank you all for being here.
Great to be here.
Thank you for having us.
So like I just said, polls have just closed, and before we go over the results, let's talk about turnout, because if you've read anything about the elections, it's all about turnout. If Gillum wins, if Ron DeSantis wins for governor, it's going to depend on who turns out to vote. And a lot being said about independence. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about the historic turnout that we're seeing here in Brevard County, 67%, which breaks the record that was previously set in 2002, which was 62.7%. Chris, you have been watching politics in Brevard County for such a long time. Probably not a surprise, because we're seeing that trend across Florida. But I mean, what is driving this?
Well, like you said, 2002 was the last time we had, a record 62%, and that was the first midterm post 9/11. So that was, we could see one of the reasons why the impetus for the driving up of turnout in that year. But this year, I think it's very clear. This Donald Trump is on the ballot, even though his name's not there, but his policies are on the ballot, his leadership is on the ballot, and I think that's what's driving a turnout up this evening.
And I understand we have some results in Brevard County already. Well, so we'll move on to turnout across the state. Catherine, when we look at the absentee ballots cast in early voting across Florida, Democrats had a slight edge. I think it was roughly half a point as of Monday. But we're starting to see some turnout in Miami-Dade and in South Florida, and those numbers mean a lot, especially for Andrew Gillum, right?
Yeah, turnout always, you want to know who's turning out and where they're turning out. Where is that population base that is turning out? And right now we are seeing in the numbers from South Florida, where there are traditionally a very large Democratic voting bloc, that are having extremely high turnout and elevated there. But that is not to say that it's not elevated across the state, because I do think that at the end of the day, we're seeing more independents, NPAs, Republicans, and Democrats. There's a much higher elevated turnout than what you would usually see for a midterm election. So.
And you hear a lot about voters who usually don't vote in midterms casting ballots this year. And you brought up independence, which is an interesting thing. Obama won the independent vote in 2012. Trump won the independent vote in 2016. I guess it's fair to say that whoever wins the race for governor or U.S. Senate is going to win that independent vote. And Gillum seems to be leading the polls, if you still trust polls, with that group. What do you guys have to say about that? What is the appeal here for independents and where they stand, in this race?
I think that particular group this time probably received more communication and more attention than the actual, two major parties. I think both parties spent considerable time and considerable money communicating to the NPAs, hopefully not to the detriment of talking to their own base. And so I think we'll pay attention to Republican turnout, pay attention to Democratic turnout, but if it gets close, the NPAs will rule the night tonight to decide which way this election may swing.
And we're already starting to see some results here in Brevard County. We see Bill Posey is leading Democrat Sanjay Patel. Obviously a very tough race for Democrats, but apparently Democrats, like you said, have been knocking on a lot of doors trying to reach out to independents. But so far it seems that Posey has a pretty comfortable lead here. I mean, any surprises, or are we seeing that all this so-called blue wave might not materialize, and then we're actually going to see Brevard stay Brevard?
Well, I think the thing to look at here is how close does Bill Posey get to 60%? If Democrats can get 43, 44% of the vote, then that tells me that there might be some, I don't know about a blue wave, but definitely some momentum on the Democratic side, perhaps across the state. Not here in Brevard County, but I think that it would be something that would tell us that there's more Democratic energy out there across Florida.
And these are preliminary results, but Bill Posey is hovering around 58 to 60%. So that doesn't seem too far from his previous results 2 years ago, right?
No. You know, the thing about the turnout, when we go back to the turnout, I was looking at the numbers earlier, and while we had 33,000 early votes in 2012, or rather 2014, we had 80,000 early votes this time around. But the proportion of Republican to Democratic votes is still the same, whether it was in 2014 or in 2018. So while there's more people that are turning out, the proportion of the voters are still the same, and the Republicans still, in Brevard County anyway, still have the advantage.
And particularly in that district, I mean, when you look at any race, you have to look at how the demographics of that particular district are made up. And quite frankly, that congressional district is a very Republican district. I think that it's stayed in both Real Clear Politics and Cook Report and all that is very likely Republican. And it's not because it's just not Brevard County. There's also Indian River County, which is equally, if not more, of a red Republican county than Brevard County. So I think Sanjay will probably has been the strongest Democratic opponent that Congressman Posey has faced, but it would take a great deal to overcome just the registration advantage.
Yeah, it seems, at least in Brevard County, that if Democrats are going to win, any seats are going to be those smaller and maybe even nonpartisan races, which is, I think, is something we should talk about. They have invested heavily in the school board races and the Palm Bay City Council race, which is also nonpartisan. And Kendo, especially in your neck of the woods, in that area of Rockledge, Cocoa, Democrats have been, very active there. They have a candidate running for the school board, Cheryl McDougall. They have a candidate running for the state house, and Victoria Michener, who is running for county commission against Brian Lober. Tell us about that. I hear reports of people saying Democrats have knocked on my door, 3-4 times during the elections, which was pretty much unheard of up to this point, right?
Right. I mean, I don't think it's a secret. I tease Catherine quite a bit about this. I mean, the Democrats have an extremely solid ground game, and it's something that's been built over time, particularly since 2008, and they've been able to maintain that component. So the number of doors knocked, measuring in the tens of thousands, can certainly make a difference, particularly on those lower level races. I think you Isadora, raised two issues. Issue number one, the Democrats are doing well by fielding solid candidates in every race, which prevents the opportunity for some of your larger candidates to spend time, energy, and money helping others rather than defending themselves. So that's part one. And then part two of that, I think Chris mentioned it earlier, it's the incremental change that you will see as Democrats continue to do better in each of those individual races. Would love to see them win, but in the event that they don't, you need to see that continued progression, and tonight will be a big test for that.
And we have some preliminary results in that part of the county. For Brevard County Commission District 2, Brian Lober is leading with 56% against Victoria Michener with 43%. I believe these are just early voting and absentee ballots. Any hope that she might come ahead at some point?
Well, I think this race right here, I think, is going to determine in large part the direction of the county commission for the next couple of years. The fact that Brian Lober was able to unseat Chuck Nelson in the primary, he self-funded. Victoria Michener has raised money. She's got an effective ground game. She's actually spending more money than Brian Lober did on this race, but I think it comes down to the partisan makeup of that district. It's going to be very difficult for her to overcome that.
And Catherine, your group, Business Voice, actually endorsed Victoria.
We did.
And you had endorsed Chuck Nelson, who was a Republican in the primary, and he lost to Brian Lober. He was a former county commissioner. Can you explain why endorse a Democrat in this race?
Sure. Well, our group, because we are nonpartisan and we do have a pretty diverse membership of local businesses and individuals in the community, and I think first and foremost, they are concerned about and they look at are people qualified to run? Do they have a good understanding and a good temperament of what they're heading into in the race that they filed to run? And quite frankly, after a late entry and a very negative campaign that was run, Mr. Lober was giving the impression off that he's much more interested in winning the race than he had been in preparing to serve on the county commission. Because Victoria had worked within the county commission in the human resources department, she came with a wealth of knowledge when she met with our group and impressed, quite frankly, everyone. And unfortunately, after we had endorsed Chuck Nelson, we invited Mr. Lober to come in and meet with us, and he would not even come in to meet with our group. So it was kind of that you're either 100% with him, or we were already on his enemy list. And we know that when you are actually elected to serve, you have to work with folks on both sides of the aisle and throughout the community. And that was just a little bit of a sign to us that maybe he wasn't quite had the temperament or wasn't running for the right reasons, and it made it pretty easy to get behind Victoria, a really quality candidate.
And up to this point, Cheryl McDougall seems to be the only Democrat who's leading. She's running for School Board District 2, which covers Cocoa, Merritt Island. She's leading with 52 to 47% against Charles Parker, who is a longtime resident of Brevard and actually works as a teacher. I mean, it's interesting that she's doing so well. What is the reason behind here?
I mean, she did knock on a tremendous number of doors. I think even made a second cycle in that particular district. And you knew that she had a very strong chance in the general when you looked at her performance in the primary, almost accomplishing 50% in a three-way race with notable names like Charles Parker and Frank Sullivan. And so certainly expected her to do well. It appears that some of the other municipal candidates that you referenced to that the Democrats supported did see Alex Goins in Cocoa and Kenny Johnson in Palm Bay, both of which kind of fall in the category, Isadora, that you referenced earlier, municipal candidates that have been focused on the program laid out by the local Democratic Party.
Yeah, so we have some preliminary results for the Palm Bay bonds referendum. They're actually trying to issue bonds to fix the roads in Palm Bay, and seems that 66% of voters so far have voted yes. I mean, we all have heard about the state of roads in Palm Bay and how bad it is, and it actually was a huge issue in the campaign. I mean, I'm surprised that people, or are you guys surprised that people actually want to vote to tax themselves on this?
Well, I mean, if you looked at Palm Bay, the referendum won is also receiving 66% of the vote, which was to allow the city council to continue to offer tax incentives to lure businesses to Palm Bay. And at the same time, we're looking at expanding our debt in Palm Bay by $150 million over the next 20 years. I got to say that I'm a tad bit surprised that Referendum 2 is receiving the kind of affirmative support that we're seeing here tonight.
You know, I am not, because we did a forum before the primary, and we asked readers to ask questions. All the questions, I thought, given everything that has happened in City Hall and all the scandals, I thought those would be the questions. But everybody wanted to know, how are you going to fix roads? You know, my road hasn't been paved. I don't live in Palm Bay, so I can't really speak for how bad the state of the roads are, but it seems like that's, you know, it's just like with the lagoon, that voters voted for a sales tax to clean up the lagoon. It seems that Brevard might not be so anti.
Well, I think that's true, not just in Brevard, but anywhere. The idea of the federal government taking your tax dollars when you don't see it is very frustrating and very hard for people, especially when it comes right from your paycheck, and that kind of, you know, gets under people's skin. But the idea when it's a local tax that's going towards something local that you will see immediate either benefit or results from a tax, you know, that's what they always say. Usually, you know, school taxes, you know, yes, they can be hard to get through, but at the end of the day, people know, okay, if this is staying in my local school district, great, okay, you know, I might be willing to step up and support that. And I think the same is true when it comes to the roads, the lagoon, the environment. And I think people, even the most conservative of folks, appreciate the idea of siloed taxation, where they're saying, this is what this money, you're going to take this money from me, but I know that it's going to go exactly to this. I'm not handing it over to the politician's general fund for where they'll put it. I know that this money is going to go towards this specific item.
And let's stay in Palm Bay a little longer. Kenny Johnson, 26-year-old Democrat, African American, first time running for office ever, is apparently winning so far with 56% of the vote. Kendo, tell us, what did he do right? I mean, I see him on social media all the time. He's young, he has that energy. He unseated Trey Holton, who was the incumbent. What are the forces at play here?
Well, I think in the primary, it was a very interesting kind of tri-focused deal where you had the other candidate, Tom Gum, who actually made it a personal crusade against Trey Holton, of which Kenny Johnson didn't participate in the primary. And like McDougal, he was another one of those Democratic candidates that came very close in the primary in the high 40s, almost doing the 50% plus one there. But I think you described it. I mean, he's got a tremendous amount of energy. He showed some significant knowledge about the issues. Obviously, as a young man and a new candidate, still has a lot to learn, but showed a willingness to do that. Campaigned harder than anyone we saw in Palm Bay this year. And last but not least, many of us that have been in this campaign business for a while, we laugh and joke a bit about the social media, but he showed that social media and doors can certainly get the job done, and he's doing very, very well tonight as a result of the energy that he put in.
And then let's just go over some other results. Palm Bay economic development is a yes with 67%. I think that was the question whether you still want to maintain tax cuts to attract businesses, tax abatements to attract businesses. So interesting thing that they're voting for a bond referendum. Well, and they also want to.
That's a great point. And like you said, with all the chaos in Palm Bay government, and new assessments that have been added over the past just 2 years, now to give that same governmental structure another $150 million of bond money to add to the debt of the city of Palm Bay, to me, it's not congruent with what we're doing here in referendum one.
I looked at the two, Isadora, and the one that got me on the economic development with the new items relating to Harris L3 and the like. They've got a solid economic development and job base down there, and I think people see the opportunity to continue to build on that. As for the roads, I think the difference that they had this time, they did the three things, and Catherine mentioned one of them. They said, here's the tax dollar we want. They gave you the mechanism that they would use, the bond, and oh, by the way, here's the list of specifically how we will spend the projects, and I think it created in the voter some confidence that allowed them to vote positively for that referendum.
And we're not seeing results in the governor's race and for U.S. Senate yet, but I want to talk about the polls and first talk about what the polls showed leading up to the elections and whether we should trust them or not, because we know what happened in 2016. Trump defied our odds and won against Hillary Clinton. But the latest polls in the governor's race show Gillum, at least the average of polls by Real Clear Politics shows Gillum with an advantage of roughly 4 points, and they also show that Nelson is leading Rick Scott for the U.S. Senate. Chris, I'm going to start with you, political science professor. What is going on with the polling, and can we trust them?
Well, I think that's a great question, and we're going to find out the answer to that tonight. But I will tell you this, is that if we do go by the polls, Democrats have a major advantage here. And that is Andrew Gillum. In 33 polls that have been taken since the primary of August 28th, Andrew Gillum has led in 32 of those 33 polls. What you cited now is 4.4%. It's outside the margin of error. So the big question now is are these polls actually modeling the electorate and the electorate correctly, or are they oversampling certain groups? We don't know yet. But if you're a Democrat and you're looking at quantitative analysis, the polls are definitely on your side and in your favor right now. Andrew Gillum, the Senate race with Bill Nelson, and just the generic ballot in general gives Democrats an advantage to take control of the House. So the poll is on the Democrat side.
And a lot of those polls, however, show that Gillum was leading, but within the margin of error, right? So it shows, and I can see how newspapers have changed the way they report about polls. Instead of saying so-and-so is winning, I see some newspapers saying, the race is neck and neck, or it's a virtual tie. And I'm glad to see that distinction, because polls can be misleading. But Catherine, what was wrong with the polls in 2016? Chris, you brought up that they overreported some groups, but where did they get it wrong?
I don't know that they necessarily get it wrong. They get it correctly for the group of people that they are polling. And so what you see is that the demographics of who polls are reaching is drastically changing. I know from any of the polling that I've seen, it is getting harder for them to reach younger voters and to get that, age breakdown sample, that they have to dial much more, go through the voter rolls more to try to get the proportionate sample of younger voters. A lot of polling locations now, pollster companies are starting to use a mixture of online polls, cell phone numbers, along with traditional, home dialing, because they have to try to reach those other demographics. And then also, I think that people are kind of wise to the method and are sick of it and are sick of all the phone calls, and they just don't pick up. And I think particularly in 2016, there was a sense, what we like to call the false modesty, where it's you say one thing on the phone because that's what they expect you'll say, or what you think you should say, but what you go in and actually put on your ballot might be something different.
And just to reiterate, I mean, we look at polls, but then again, it's who shows up to vote. How can we emphasize so much that it is about turnout? Because polls don't mean anything if those people don't.
Well, it's
really
important to remember,
right?
Polling at the end of the day should just be a tool, and we had talked about this the last time when I was with you. At the end of the day, all of these polls that get released, the question of who's in the lead at those top of the ticket races are only one of probably 10 to 20 other questions they're asking. And a lot of times they're asking what issues are motivating you, if not specific messaging, and then if not, favorabilities and unfavorabilities. And so the real resource of polling is not in that generic, if the election were today, who would you vote for? The real resource in the use that people like Kendall and myself and you, if you dabble in it, we are looking at the other questions that are getting asked as well. Just how strongly is your favorability unfavorably? Just how strongly are people responding to the various messages that you're testing in the poll? And that head-to-head question that gets released for the newspapers is really, for some reason, that's what the public likes to read and look, but it's not really what's used on a campaign or what we find is useful.
Right.
And then, Chris, earlier you brought up the balance of power in the House. If you believe the polls, Democrats are poised to retake the House. They need 23 seats.
23 seats.
And everybody's talking about suburban white women and how they might turn against Trump. And a lot of times we talk so much about Trump's base, but really the voters who carried him through the election were women and were those people who can swing back and forth, and they sided with Trump in 2016.
Sure, they did. I mean,
what's going on
listen,
now?
Democrats elected Donald Trump president. I don't mean to be offensive, but when you take a look at Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, states that hadn't voted for Republican for president since 1988, Wisconsin since 1984, all of those districts that went for Gore in 2000, Kerry in 2004, Obama twice, those districts went blue, or rather went red in 2016, and none of the polls picked up on that. And then I also wanted to point out that in 2012, Mitt Romney was supposed to win Florida by 5.7 percentage points. He actually lost by 0.3 percentage point. So I'll tell you, when it comes to the state polling, we've had some serious challenges when it comes to accuracy. And as Catherine pointed out, one of the big challenges we're facing now is low participation in the polls. So that getting an actual snapshot of the electorate is becoming more and more difficult.
Wow, it's going to be interesting for pollsters how they're going to do, because in 2016 they obviously lost, and I'm sure that they have changed the way they operate now. I mean, you would assume that that's the case. But let's look again at some of the results. We have Brian Lober leading still in County Commission District 2 with 56%, and Victoria Michener, the Democrat, were at 43% of the vote. Seems that hasn't changed since last time we checked. So, and I'm not sure how many precincts are reporting at this point, but Bill Posey maintains a strong lead. 65% precincts in now. Bill Posey maintains a strong lead against Sanjay Patel with nearly 60%. And now we're looking on the screen, Kurt Smith in County Commission District 4 with 61%. Not news, that's a heavily GOP district. For the school board, Cheryl McDougall, again, a Democrat. It seems that Charles Parker is slowly catching up to her. Could that be the closest race in Brevard, is a race for the school board? I
mean, it very well could be. I mean, that's a hotly contested race this evening, and they continue to communicate through the three methods of voting, and so would love to see how that one turns out tonight, but expect it to be close.
Yeah, it seems so. Kenny Johnson and Cheryl McDougal are the only two Democrats who are leading at this point. It seems.
Alex Goins and Coco.
And Alex in Coco. And let's talk about the race for Coco Mayor. That has turned out to be quite interesting, although people don't usually follow municipal races. So we have Larry Sinclair, who is a convicted felon, who's running for Coco Mayor, and that has caused some controversy. Kendall, you're closer to Coco than any of us, so what's going on there?
Well, you have a very interesting mix. Mr. Sinclair has been somewhat of a community activist and advocate over the years. He's involved in some community redevelopment activities and very interested in some of the contracting things in Coco. And he's competing against two former city council members, one, Clarence Whipple, who's sitting on the council now, and during Mr. Whipple's prior term, he also served with the other candidate, who is Jake Williams. So you have two prior candidates, Mr. Whipple, who served in District 1, Jake Williams, who served in District 2, and Mr. Sinclair, the new candidate. And it appears from the numbers so far that it's a very close race.
Yeah, and so some very preliminary results in the governor's race. According to our website, floridatoday.com, which I advise you to go and check it out. We have a live database that updates automatically with election results from the entire state. But that shows Ron DeSantis leading with 52% against Andrew Gillum with 46%. And this is the caveat, 3 of 6,100 precincts reporting. So if you're talking about preliminary, it's very preliminary. According to this very early results as well, Rick Scott is leading with 51% to 48%. I'm not sure what parts of the state these precincts are, so more to come on that front. So let's talk about the U.S. Senate race. Rick Scott entered the race a long time ago. His likability rating has increased throughout his tenure. He's been the governor for almost 8 years now. He entered the race. He's a millionaire. He can self-fund. Bill Nelson has been an incumbent for a long time, and he's trying to paint Nelson as this career politician. Has it worked, Chris?
Well, I mean, this race is extremely close. I think this is the most competitive race that Bill Nelson has been in probably 30 years. He's been blessed over the past couple of cycles to face some pretty hapless Republican opponents in Connie Mack Jr. and Catherine Harris and even Bill McCollum back in the day. But, listen, I think Rick Scott as governor has been very effective. He campaigned on 700,000 jobs in 7 years, and that turned out to be actually 1.6 million during his tenure. He's made significant inroads with Latino and Hispanic voters. There's no question about it. His numbers almost look like Jeb Bush numbers from back in '98 and the 2002 campaign. So I think this is going to go down to the wire, and I think Rick Scott is definitely the most competitive Republican that's been nominated for this seat in quite a long time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at Rick Scott, I want to say 3 to 4 years ago, nobody in Florida really liked him, but it's impressive to see how he has positioned himself, especially, and I want to say the hurricanes, right? Catherine is a Republican. He handled himself very well and certainly benefited from the post-storm boost, but he is a retail politician, and Rick Scott does not have, if there is a ribbon cutting for your local Chamber of Commerce and you put in a request to get the governor, odds are he might come down and meet. So there's a lot of people in Florida between post-storm recovery and just him really liking being in the community and certainly focusing on that jobs. Whenever there was new job announcement, not just in Brevard County, but anywhere around the state, he was happy to be there. And as we just saw, he was here in Brevard yesterday on Monday, and I think they reported over 250 people came out to cheer him on. So I think he has done a good job for the economy. He was a strong leader in that sense, and when you have a nice booming economy like we see, a lot of people give him the credit. And you saw Bill Nelson was trailing in a lot of polls a few months ago. He starts spending more money, and now they're, I want to say, neck and neck, although Bill Nelson has been leading in some polls a lot of times within the margin of error. But Kendall, how do you think Rick Scott's attacks on Bill Nelson have worked in this campaign? Do you see, is Bill Nelson still perceived as a career politician, or is he perceived as someone who's likable?
I mean, he's been there for an extended period of time, and they made the decision that would be the focus. I think he's been able to do two things. Chris pointed out one of them. His increase in numbers in the Hispanic and Latino vote have been a tremendous piece that he was missing. The second one was people always worried about the concern of the Andrew Gillum Nelson to do. Is one going to take the forefront? Are they going to bump into each other? What's going to happen? And we watched in this race, there were times when Gillum needed it and Nelson took the forefront, and there were other times when Gillum was surging and Nelson was willing to join the crowd and be a part of that. And you watched, and we kind of would laugh a little bit. You'd have to watch to see who would speak last at the given event. And it went back and forth, you know, as the polls moved or where they were speaking. And I think their ability to work together tonight may show, if they're both successful, that their ability to work together and, for lack of a better phrase, cross-collateralize places where they were strong may be the good part for both of them.
Yeah, so let's talk about my favorite topic, the constitutional amendments. I'll tell you this, Florida Today has seen like pretty much record numbers on our website, people just searching for the constitutional amendments on Google. And it was obvious that people were very confused. And I want to thank the Constitutional Revision Commission for bundling like 3 to 4 proposals into one amendment. Chris, explain why the CRC is able to do that. And I mean, is that fair to voters?
Well, I'll take your second question first. Is it fair to voters? Obviously not. This is a terrible way to run policy making by bundling all these kinds of non-germane issues together, utilizing what they can to provide hooks to draw people in, and then they get what they really want to prove that way. And the answer, why do they do what they do? And the answer to it is because they can. Because they can. You know, this is really one amendment that we should see. This is the mother of all ballots, by the way. This thing took 15, 20 minutes for the average person to go through, when actually it should take a lot longer because there's so much here. But that's one thing we've got to do, is reform this revision commission and not allow them, hold them to the same standard, and that is one topic per amendment. I think that would make go a long way in making this a much better process. A lot of people might not be aware that the Revision Commission meets once every 20 years. So in this particular election cycle, we've got
and they're
amendments
politically
that
appointed as well.
Well, they are. That's right. 15 are appointed by the governor, 9 by the Speaker of the House, 9 by the President of the Senate, 3 are chosen by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the Attorney General is seated. This year we had an overwhelming Republican-led Revision Commission. Unlike 20 years ago in 1998, I was very involved in that one. It was much more bipartisan. You had a Democratic governor and a Democratic Attorney General, and Bob Butterworth and Lawton Chiles. So it was a very different animal 20 years ago. But with all of these proposals bundled together, the volume of policies here, I think this is really a terrible way to conduct policy making.
And we have some preliminary results. Again, go to floridatoday.com for these. Amendment 1 seems to be leading with 62%. And again, very few precincts reporting statewide, so very preliminary results. I want to make that clear. And Amendment 1 is probably one of the most important amendments on the ballot this year. It creates a third homestead exemption for the assessed value of a home between $100,000 and $125,000. Local governments are panicking about it because they're going to lose a lot of their revenue. Brevard could lose up to $12 million in the first year. So tell us the pros and cons of this amendment. I'll start with you, Kenda. What are the pros and cons in your view in this, and how do you feel about it?
I think it's been, you look at the way that it's been marketed, and Chris referenced it earlier, you know, you're hard pressed sometimes when you're saying to them, I can give you a break on what you pay. And many people are looking positively in that regard, but then not fully understanding the impact on their local government. So if you do get that break on your individual home, those $12 million for Brevard and other cities around that have estimated exactly what it's going to take. And we got a chance to actually get an idea from many of the cities as they talked about it in this budget cycle, simply anticipating that it could pass. And so I think on the general fund, we're going to see some communities with some fairly significant cuts. And if it were to pass, people not fully understanding what services and service levels that they may lose as a result of those dollars that are out there. But it was marketed in the community as direct savings to individuals, and that's a hard thing for some individuals to pass up.
And Florida, I thought it was interesting that Florida Tax Watch, which is a watchdog nonprofit, they came out against Amendment 1 because it increases the burden on non-homestead properties, including commercial properties and rentals, and that local governments might actually increase the tax rate to make up for that lost revenue, which means that people without a homestead exemption, again, are going to carry that burden. Am I being too alarmist here, Chris?
Well, if you look at the projection is for the first year, $650 million loss. We have 67 counties. That's about $9 million per county. But I think one thing we're leaving out is that this isn't a net loss, because when people have more money to spend, they're not going to put it under their mattress. They're going to go out and they're going to spend that. And so local governments will collect that money through sales tax and through other revenue sources. So to say that that's going to be a net loss of $12 million for the county, I think is incorrect. Again, this is not the position of Eastern Florida State College, its benefactors, or faculty and staff members. So this is my own take on this. But whenever you can give people a break on the American dream, which is home ownership, sign me up. Sign me up.
Well, I'm glad that we got to hear both sides of the issue, and I want to go back to amendments because it's so interesting. But I want to go over some of our local results. In House District 51, which is an open seat, the incumbent Tom Goodson is termed out. Tyler Soroy, the Republican, is leading with almost 58% of the vote against Mike Blake. His family is very well known in Cocoa. He is a former Cocoa mayor. And now let's move on to District 53 in the Florida House. That's Randy Fine and Phil Moore. And people at home might have heard about Randy Fine. He has been quite controversial here in Brevard because of some of the stances he has taken with regards to how local government operates. He's leading with 55% versus 44% for the Democrat Phil Moore in this race. That is a district that Democrats could carry this year because it is the most Democratic leaning district in Brevard. So, Kendall, what is going wrong in this district? Why haven't Democrats been able to carry this one?
I think on the southern end of the county, both in terms of the House as well as the two county commission districts, looking at those three, those are the most winnable by number and by percentage breakdown between Republicans and Democrats. To Randy Fine's past campaigns and even this year, well structured, well funded. He has consistently worked hard, and I think ultimately for the Democrats to compete, even though the numbers are equal, it's going to take some significant revenue and significant push down there. I mean, hey, look, if you get outspent, that doesn't mean you lose, but you can't let the ratio get close to 10 to 1. And I think Representative Fine has been clear about his willingness or capability to raise money and willingness to spend his own personal resources for the preservation of that. And certainly he did so again this year. And I think the numbers in that race tonight are reflecting that.
And in House District 52, no surprises here. Thad Allman, the Republican incumbent, is leading with 63%. Again, very expected. In County Commission District 2, we have Brian Lober. He continues to lead with 58%. Victoria Michener, the Democrat, is down with 42%. Catherine, are these results surprising to you in District 2?
No, I don't think so, because that district in and of itself leans Republican. I mean, it is a Republican seat. So in order for a Democrat to overcome in that seat, you have to guarantee that you win not only all of your Democrats, but you take a significant portion of the independents. And I think, as we know, independents do break, still the majority. You have to assume that some will go to Republican. They're not going to just all break towards the Democrats. So she definitely had a deficit. The thought being was that because he'd been such an unpopular candidate after a very negative primary campaign, that he was going in, risking not having a solid base, and that there was an opportunity if his base wouldn't, if all of the Republicans would not necessarily, if you'd have that crossover of Republicans who were going to be supporting Ms. Michener. But I think at this point, I can't see your percentage turnout in what they have now. But that 6,000 deficit is going to be a little bit hard for her to overcome at this point.
Wow, and I want to give a quick update in the governor's race. Again, very preliminary results, but seems that Andrew Gillum is catching up to Ron DeSantis. My results just disappeared from my screen. But let's talk about Donald Trump, Chris, which we haven't talked. It's been almost 40 minutes. But Ron DeSantis ran in the primary as the Trump guy. He's a former congressman. He had commercials in which his kids were building Lego walls or
in the bathtub.
in the back.
Yeah.
Very interesting, and it made national headlines and everything. So what is the Trump factor here for DeSantis?
Yeah, listen, Ron DeSantis would not be the Republican nominee if it wasn't for a tweet from the president. I mean, everybody thought that Adam Putnam was a shoo-in. He had been groomed for this seat for decades. But it was just that one tweet. It was under 150 characters, and that's all it took to make Ron DeSantis the Republican candidate. Now, the thing about this race, though, is if you look at it just from a policy standpoint, this race really should not be competitive at all. Florida is ranked the #1 fiscally stable state in the nation by George Mason University. We're number 5 in the country for job growth. Our GDP just hit $1 trillion, making us the 17th largest economy on the planet. And I've always said Ron DeSantis should be able to sleepwalk his way into the governor's mansion. I think he took me literally, though. It is one of the most underwhelming campaigns that I've seen. With all of these factors, the wind is at his back. It just is amazing that he has not been able to capitalize on this. And I guess that would go to just the effective campaign of Andrew Gillum. I don't know if the Medicare for all is a great mantra, because I don't even think we're going to get Medicaid for all, let alone Medicare for all. But it's surprising that this race is as tight as it is in a midterm election year that usually favors Republicans.
I think DeSantis is lucky that Trump was willing to come to Florida this last week for him, because if Trump had not come, I think that his standings would have fallen further.
We're just going to take a short break. Chris and I are going to go over the results, and when we come back, we're going to be joined by Matt Nye and Amy Ted. Chris, we're going to go over the results in a minute, and Catherine and Kendall will be back in about 20 minutes. So let's look again at County Commission District 2. Brian Lober continues to lead 57-42. I think there was a lot of hype around Victoria Michener, and a lot of people seem to think that she could pull it off, and she might still be able to.
Well, you know, Brian Lober was a newcomer, and taking on an incumbent in a primary and getting them removed from office, that usually causes bad blood, as Catherine had referenced earlier. So looks like he's pulling that one out.
Yeah, and this is Misty Belford in School Board District 1. She's running against the write-in, so no surprises. Right. 95. I'm surprised the write-in got 1,700
people took the time to write in.
Sheena Moore, she came to our forums. School Board District 2, which covers Cocoa, Merritt Island. Sharon McDougal.
This is a big race down there. Yep. Andy Ziegler was removed from office, and we've got this very competitive race. Looks like Katie Campbell is going to be in that seat.
And now Canaveral Port Authority, Robin Hathaway seems to be leading. Cape Canaveral Mayor, are you familiar with this race?
Robert Hoog, he's run before. A couple of these candidates we've seen in the past. Looks like Robert Hoog will be, it's close there, but he seems to have a slight edge.
Now moving on to the next one. City of Cocoa Mayor, that's turned out to be quite an interesting race. We have Jake Williams Jr. leading with 38%, followed by Larry Sinclair and Clarence Whipple Jr.
James Goins looks like he's handily winning that District 1 seat.
And he's a Democrat, as Kendall pointed out. That was City of Cocoa.
Lorraine Koss, 66%.
And I know that's a municipal race, but I've heard her name a lot in the last few months and on social media. So it seems like that might have worked. Now Cocoa Beach, town of Malabar. So Brian Vale is winning with 83 votes.
Just a handful of votes down there. Steve Rivet, 59%. Melbourne, of course, some very important races. Mark LaRusso in the lead there, but that's a very close race.
And Betty Moore is the incumbent.
Right.
So interesting.
Debbie Thomas very handily leading there, and Julie Sanders also.
And Teresa Lopez is the incumbent, and she's behind. So interesting. A lot has been going on in the city of Melbourne. Town of Melbourne Beach Commissioner for a 3-year term. There are actually 2 different races on the ballot for the Town of Melbourne Beach. One of them is for a 3-year term, and the other one is for a 1-year term. Chris, why does that happen?
You know, that's a great question that I don't know the answer to. But I know that they can manipulate their charters to a great degree to account for these kind of changes.
And now Palm Bay City Council, Kenny Johnson leading with 58% against Thomas Gom, 41%. And remember, they both came ahead of the incumbent in that race, which was Trey Holton. Trey Holton was involved in some of the scandals surrounding City Hall. Now Jeff Bailey, who is the incumbent, seems to be doing pretty well against Aaron Parr. We had them all at Florida Today in our offices. City of Titusville.
Jolynn Nelson, not even close. And here you have the top 3 vote getters will be serving on the city council.
Now this is a very interesting one. The Cocoa Beach, this is changing the height. Currently in Cocoa Beach, you cannot build higher than 45 feet. This adds some sort of allowance on top for, if you have an elevator. And that has been such a contentious issue in Cocoa Beach. It's interesting to see that it's doing well, because what a lot of developers are saying is that if you allowed us to build just a little higher in Cocoa Beach, we can renovate hotels, we can spur economic development. And Cocoa Beach has been trying to sort of, I don't want to say upgrade their tourist base, but they're trying to bring more higher income people. And they seem to be, hedging their bets that this will help them. Palm Bay Economic Development, yes, with 68%. What was this referendum again? Well,
allowing for the city to offer tax abatement to lure businesses to Palm Bay, to make Palm Bay competitive with other cities in our state and really all over the country, to compete and to bring jobs to Palm Bay.
And again, that's the bond referendum in Palm Bay. Yes is leading with 66%. Chris, you seem to be dismayed a little bit that they're voting to actually go into more debt.
Well, you would think. I mean, with Palm Bay's government being the way that it has been for the last few years, the chaos and the tumult there, and then now we're going to entrust them with $150 million over the next 20 years which is going to be added to ad valorem taxes. Just seems a tad bit surprising that it's this lopsided.
So now we have new guests here on set with us, and they're going to be talking about some of the things that they have heard on the ground. We have Amy Titt. She's a Democrat and a former candidate for the Florida Senate, and Matt Nye. He is the founder of the Republican Liberty Caucus of Central East Florida. Did I get it right, Matt?
You did, and the national chairman as well.
And the national chairman. So Amy, I'm going to start with you since you're closer, but in the first few minutes we were talking about how Democrats have resurged in Brevard County. What is going on in terms of ground game? What are Democrats doing different than they did before 2016?
They have had a complete rebirth. I just want to give a shout out to Stacey Patel, who's the DEC chair. The last 2 years, her and her husband have worked in Brevard to just completely overhaul. I mean, a few years ago, we had maybe 30 people as DEC members. This past year, they had over 1,000. At every poll today, there was a table with Democrats check in here, people working their hearts out. And it's been a big effort. And I just want to congratulate them for their.
And Matt, this is obviously still a heavily Republican county.
Sure.
What do you see of these efforts? What is your take on this?
So I completely agree with Amy. There's no question the Democrats were reborn, so to speak, this cycle here. They were very well organized. I know I heard and saw many communications from the local Republican Party about the fact that the Democrats were so well organized. And I think, traditionally, just because it's a predominantly Republican county, the local Republican Party has been able to maybe not work as hard as they needed to. And so this time there was definitely a fire lit, and I think they've done better as a party organizing than they have in past years. I don't think, quite frankly, that they were on par with, or we were on par with the organization of the ground.
So you like that?
Democrats.
It seems like you like that competition.
I think it helps. Yes, absolutely. So it definitely gets people on our side motivated and turns them out. So there's no question. Turnout was at record highs this time. Both sides are, heavily engaged and motivated. So.
And we see a record turnout. Last time I checked, turnout in Brevard County was 67%, which breaks the record for any midterm. The previous record in 2002 was just over 62%. So great. I think it's great for democracy. But we haven't talked a lot about Trump, Chris, but I want to get Amy's and Matt's take on this. Obviously, Trump got elected in 2016, and you see all this energy in the Democratic Party. How much is really about Trump, and how much is about other issues? What are you hearing from voters on the ground?
Well, when Trump was put in, he had 3 million votes less. And we know that there was Russian hacking into the election. We know that there is things that are wrong for American democracy. And there are people all over America that are saying that he is not representing the people that we are. He is not representing the good and strong and brave America that went in and saved Germany from the Nazis. We are better than that. And so there are people that have put their lives on hold to work to bring back the America that they believe in, that they care about.
We talk about, I don't think there's been any evidence of Russian hacking. I think there's been evidence that there was some Russian meddling through social media, but not necessarily hacking. Am I getting you right here?
Well, we'll see. That comes out next week. Robert Mueller will be releasing his investigation, depending on what happens with the House tonight. If the Democrats take the House, then we might find out information.
And Matt, I want to ask you, Trump obviously has that star factor. Republicans love him. What do you hear from Republicans on the ground in terms of, there's so much about how much he tweets and his rhetoric,
Sure.
But it seems that Republicans really like that he has stuck to his campaign promises and seems to be following through on them.
Well, the latter is absolutely correct. I mean, he's definitely been more consistent than probably any other, or at least he's made more progress, let's put it that way, in following through on campaign promises than prior Republican presidents. And there's no question, the vast majority of his base, the Republicans are ginned up by the fact that he actually fights back. He doesn't take the biased media attacks and things like that lying down. He does fight back, and that's a big part of his appeal. He speaks plainly. The tweets, and again, I could leave some of them for sure, but it does give him the ability to communicate directly with the American people. He can essentially sidestep, the traditional network media and get his message out that way. So, no, I think he's done a phenomenal job, and that's in terms of strategy. I've seen and read a lot here in the last few days, last week, where he's essentially made this, and it's not just him, I'm sure strategists as well have made this election about him, right? Because they're looking at that star factor, like you said. I mean, I know in my own primary, I had made some negative comments about him back in the presidential primary, and those came back to haunt me, on 3 different postcards in my
about
race.
Trump?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, and they were policy specific. It wasn't like I just don't like Trump. It was like, hey, I don't think he's right on this issue. But those absolutely were used against me in the primary. So.
And so saying when you run I would never want to run for office because everything you say, especially when you don't have a filter like me, it's
same here, especially especially on social media.
So, and let's talk about the president's rhetoric leading up to the elections. He's talking a lot about the caravan of Central American migrants that is trying to get to the U.S. Immigration seems to be a major motivator for the Republican base. And Matt, I want to ask you, why is that? Is that really a motivator? Is that what you hear here in Brevard?
It certainly appears to be nationwide. I mean, I know as the Republican Liberty Caucus, we've done a lot of harvesting of email addresses and things, and that's one of the issues that gathers the most, signatures in terms of capturing data. But I think the immigration thing just boils down to basic law and order, right? It's a question about, do you believe that people should come into this country legally or not? And it's a very emotional issue, and I think that's why they've chosen, again, I think Trump chose to focus on that issue as opposed to the economy, because quite frankly, I think people, if you got your tax cut, I know I did, I saw the refund, I think they assume implicitly that the voter knows, right, the economy's going well because they're doing better, and so they focused on the immigration issue and not so much on the economy.
And Amy, talking about the local efforts here in Brevard County in trying to turn out voters, Florida Today did a story that showed that actually the number of registered Democrats has decreased since, I believe, 2016. How do you explain that decrease? And you see so much effort in trying to register people, but you actually see a decrease.
Well, the Motor Voter Act that was put in by Clinton had a big impact on how people register to vote. People used to decide after they'd had a lot of education what they're going to, and they understood what a Democrat and a Republican are. Now people go in when they're 15. They've been studying for their test. They're ready to pass their driver's test. And someone asks them, would you like to be registered to vote? And they're like, what? And then they ask it again. They say, okay, well, what do you want to register as? And they've been studying the traffic laws and the stop signs. And so they just say, no party. And so at 15, they're making a decision. Then 3 or 4 years later, we're judging them by. So I just believe that there's sort of a disconnect in how people get registered to vote now.
And I want to talk about some of the local races here. We have Brian Lober running in County Commission District 2 against Victoria Michener. She is the Democrat. A lot of hopes were placed on Victoria. She got an endorsement from Business Voice. She had money coming in to help her. Amy, I'm not sure how many precincts are reporting, but if Democrats don't do as well as you hoped in this election, what is next for the Democratic Party?
Well, we'll just have to see what I'm no longer a member of the DEC. That I work on other things, and they have worked very hard to bring back the party, and they had to build a ground game. We had nobody. I mean, we had no. So they've been working. I really want to congratulate Stacey and everyone. They put people in soil and water. They put city council. They ran a unified team. Their flyers that they put on 100,000 doors this weekend had every race on it. This has never been done before.
Yeah.
So you have to start. If the Republicans did this 20 years ago here, they started putting people on all the zoning boards and the city council. You cannot run for Congress and win, especially if you don't have you never sat on a zoning board? You have to know how to get
and
3
it's about
votes your
grooming
way.
candidates and getting that name recognition as well.
So I believe that they have just begun, and there's great things ahead.
And Matt, this has become a referendum on Trump more than anything else. If we see, I'm looking at the results here in the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race. It seems like they're very neck and neck. No one seems to be ready to call those races. But if Andrew Gillum and Bill Nelson pull this off, what does that mean for the Trump brand?
Well, in and of itself, I wouldn't say too much. I would wait to see what happens across the rest of the country, right, to see if there's a trend. Again, I think in general, the Republicans have been out-organized by the Democrats, quite frankly. And I think the reason, or the question you asked earlier about why is Democrat voter registration down, I honestly think it's the extreme, the fringe of the party has taken over, that the message is honestly not that popular, and I think that's part of the reason that they're suffering on that side. Their organizational skills are phenomenal. So,
and what do you mean by that, organizational skills?
Just the ground, like we talked about, the ground game,
knocking on doors.
Correct, and the technology. They typically, like my experience in the last 10 years, is they always seem to lead in technology, no matter what we do on the Republican side. They still maintain the edge. I know I personally reached out to a couple of services that I wanted to use as a campaign, and they literally said, we can't help you because you're a Republican. They only help Democrat candidates. So they're very, on the really cutting edge proprietary stuff, they withhold access. So kudos to them.
Well, that's very interesting. Some insight I hadn't heard before. But I want to talk about the school board race in District 2 and in District 5. In District 2, we have Cheryl McDougall. She is leading with 51% against 48% against Charles Parker. It's a nonpartisan race, but Cheryl is a Democrat. In District 5, Katie Campbell, who is a Republican, is leading Kelly Demeraux. Very interesting how these races that are nonpartisan have become very partisan. I want to hear your thoughts. I know you're both partisan people, but is that a good thing? Amy, we'll start with you.
Well, one of the things I did need to mention is that it's not just the Democrats that are working this year. There is a lot of groups that are working. Moms Against Gun Violence, there's Indivisible, there's Speak Out Brevard. There is a bunch of different groups that are not allied with the Democratic Party, but have stepped up and said these issues are important. People are tired of their kids dying in school because somebody can easily get access to an AR-15. People are sick of that. Other countries, civilized countries, do not allow their children to be gunned down and go, oh well. This last week, they had a shooting and they allowed that school to reopen that same day now.
So Matt, why do you think these nonpartisan races have become so partisan?
Well, I honestly think it's a good thing because in my experience, the nonpartisan races tend to favor the left of center candidates because, again, you get all of these groups, League of Women Voters, these others, where they say they're nonpartisan, but if you look at their platform, it's very clearly they're closely aligned typically, with the Democrats or, again, just left of center in general. So in my mind, the fact that people are pointing out, hey, this is the Republican in this race is actually a positive because, again, just going back, typically the Republican's going to be a fiscal conservative, so at least in terms of smaller government, lower taxes, those are good things. So yeah, I'm not a fan, honestly, of the nonpartisan approach. So.
And then very quickly, so we can wrap up, by the end of the night, how are you feeling about your party's chances in the 2018 midterms?
I think it's very exciting. I think good things are going to happen tonight. And here in Brevard, we're going to have an impact on that. The Democratic Party may not win as many races here in Brevard, but the votes that they're bringing in today will affect the Senate and the governor's race. They are not getting the amount of Republican votes here in Brevard that the Republicans want.
Matt, it seems like you agree with
That's
her
exactly,
assessment.
well, no, I mean, typically other parts of the state look to Brevard, right, to make up the difference, like you say, in South Florida. And Amy's exactly right. If we don't have that very large margin, we may not be able to cover the spread in some of the other counties, and that could be very costly. So, and I want to make it clear, it occurred to me as I was sitting here that sounds like I'm down on Republicans. I'm not. They've done an excellent job this cycle. They really have in terms of, I just, objectively speaking, from what I've seen here and across the country with the other RLC charters in different states, again, just on the whole, the Democrats seem to be more effective with some of the basic nuts and bolts of campaigning.
Amy and Matt, thank you so much for being here, and hope to see you again in 2020.
Okay.
All right.
And Chris and I
Well,
were
thank you for having us.
Thank you. And Chris and I are going to go over the results once again in case you just tuned in. So again, we're back to County Commission District 2, Brian Lober versus Victoria Michener.
Big race. That's going to move the County Commission, I think, to right of center. And with Kurt Smith leading handily, of course, the Republicans continue their dominance on the County Commission.
And again, we're back to school board. That's a no-brainer. Again, District 2, very, very close still. Cheryl McDougall and Charles Parker. What is your take on this school board district?
Well, I think it's fascinating, again, because of the nonpartisan nature. It was a great question, great topic. And I tend to agree with Matt and I that these nonpartisan races allow for people to kind of have a veil or a mask about what their real intentions are, what their real agenda would be, and they have the luxury of telling one group that they're with them and the opposing group that they're with them, and there's really no way to decipher that. So I think withholding that information from the voter is not a good thing. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Isadora, but in our nonpartisan races, particularly for judges, last election cycle, about 50,000 Brevard County voters skipped over their nonpartisan section of their ballot. Now, what does that tell you? I mean, the voter just realizes there's not enough information to go on.
Or do your research. Could that be it? I literally have friends who the day of the election are like, so who should I vote for? First, I'm not here to endorse people. I encourage you to do your own research, but a lot of times I think people.
It's a big ballot.
It's
a big ballot.
And
so.
thanks to the Constitution Revision Commission for making this an extra long ballot. If you go to FloridaToday.com, you see our endorsements. And I want to talk about amendments again. We endorse very few of them, especially because of the bundling issue. Right. I think the only bundled amendment that we endorsed was the amendment that bans offshore drilling and vaping indoors at the same time. And I know it doesn't make a lot of sense to have those two together, but it seems like those are two important issues. But what are your guys' takes on this?
The amendments, I think, will be very interesting to see what the drop-off, as you were saying, that there's always a drop-off when it comes to like judicial or nonpartisan races, when voters just simply, if they don't have that partisan cue, they don't know what to do. In a few days when we have all the data, it'll be very interesting to go back and look and see which of these amendments had significant drop-off. And I think that there's a few that had pretty strong campaigns to support them, the Amendment 3, Amendment 4, that had statewide campaigns. Maybe you don't see as much of a drop-off, whereas some of those bundled ones that nobody was really actively campaigning for them, they're very confusing. You don't know what it is. I bet at the end of the day, the percentage of people who actually took the time to vote yes or no is going to be significantly less than what the overall turnout was for that election.
And I want to go back to and Kendall, this one is for you, because I know you have been involved with this issue, the Cocoa Beach height referendum. Hot topic in Cocoa Beach. Can you explain what that referendum is about? And it's leading, the yes is leading with more than 50% of the vote. Do they need a 60% vote to pass, or is it just a simple majority?
So what you have in Cocoa Beach is some years ago they did pass a hard height limit at 45 feet. And ultimately the City Commission as well as the community had an in-depth number of discussions talking about everything from some of the sea level rise issues to new construction options to community redevelopment to where things should be limited. And ultimately there were some developer-driven initiatives that came forward, but there were members of the City Commission who stepped forward and took the varying proposals and crafted them into one that they brought forward. The City Commission ultimately had the final say, and if I recollect, voted 5-0 to put that on the ballot as it was. And so ultimately now you will have the same 45 feet, but it is going to be built above, and it would take an extended amount of time for me to explain base flood elevation and the number of things that would allow you to make the building go a bit higher, as well as allowing for some appurtenances on the top to have a more aesthetically pleasing building. So I think it is a positive and appropriate step for Cocoa Beach that allows greater economic development. But as I think everyone continued to say, we're not interested in high rises. And so it still remains technically in the mid-rise category for the city of Cocoa Beach.
We have some state results. Can we go back to the governor's race? If I were Andrew Gillum or Ron DeSantis, I would be biting my nails. I probably wouldn't have nails left at the end of the night. But if we can go back to that again, Ron DeSantis has 49.59%, Andrew Gillum 49.20%. OMG.
Just a few thousand votes are separating DeSantis and Gillum, as well as Rick Scott and Bill Nelson in the Senate race. It is a nail biter down to the wire. And like we started off the program tonight, it's all going to come down to turnout. It's been shifting here. Rick Scott, every time we update, we get somebody else in the lead here. So this is it's going to be a long evening.
So the Panhandle, the polls close at 8 p.m. because they're in Central Time. Could they make a difference in this? Because usually they tend to lean
no question about it.
They certainly could, but you also have sometimes in the South Florida larger counties in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, they may be a little bit slower to report that they end up on the schedule associated with the counties that are an hour behind. And so I think you've heard us quietly ask the question as we've talked tonight, what are the percentages that are reporting and who has not reported? Because I think that's going to be the story once we know, what votes are still outstanding.
And let's talk about the black vote. Just looking at absentee and early voting, it seems like black voters were overperforming. They represented roughly 13% of people who had voted up to that point, and they also represent around 13% of the electorate. I mean, could they decide the election this year? It seems, but white voters are also doing really well.
I think, one thing that some of my good consultant friends hate, and I still speak heavily about it, and that's identity politics. I mean, it still exists that we are, and amongst this broad, diverse country that we are, we still have some homogeneous groups and populations based on race, gender, and a variety of things, and we look at, how they participate. Obviously, in Florida and Georgia, these are two history-making campaigns, and that can't be understated. I talked to my 14 and 16-year-old about this. It's 2018, and we still start off many things referring to African American as first. And as long as we're still doing that, that is something that I think the community will consistently pay attention to. Tonight, and particularly in Brevard, what we also saw was that there were other groups that also outperformed as well. And so I think if it was not necessarily an isolated thing that African Americans turned out well, but it should not be understated just how much they may have an impact tonight on this statewide race.
And let's go back to the amendments for a second. And if we can go back to Amendment 1, that's the third homestead exemption. So far, it's getting close. The threshold for all the constitutional amendments is 60%. So if you get less than 60%, the amendment doesn't pass. So Amendment 1 is hovering at 58%. Seems that it might be on pace to actually passing. Amendment 2 is 66% yes. And explain Amendment 2, Catherine. I know you've been campaigning hard for it.
Sure. Amendment 2 back, let's go back over a decade, we have to say. So we have to go back about 12 or 15 years. As we saw the property exemptions placed on homesteaded properties, what we saw happen was that localities and municipalities and counties would really shift the burden of the tax. Okay, well, if I can't collect that millage from these homesteaded properties that now have that exemption, we will, raise millage, or we'll just try to collect more from commercial, your non-homesteaded residential properties, and then larger, rental type places, whoever owns that property. And in some years, we saw some non-homesteaded properties see increases of 30, 40, 60% in their taxes year over year. And it was really getting out of control. So we went statewide and had a constitutional cap put on the amount of taxes that could be collected from those non-homesteaded properties, a 10% cap. When they went to the voters in 2008, it was only for 10 years. And so that is expiring on December 31st this year. So if Amendment 2 fails, what we are going to see is that cap removed. And I think the fear that a lot of businesses, and certainly anybody who owns any property that's not under a homestead exemption, was concerned that if Amendment 1 passed, they added a third homestead exemption, and Amendment 2 fails, we're going to see an instant tax shift then, and that all of those property taxes are going to go back to the days where, and you can't budget for that. Like, how can you possibly budget if year over year you don't know what your tax bill might be?
And back to the U.S. Senate race, seems that Rick Scott has now taken the lead with 50.02%, and Bill Nelson has 49.98%. That is what, 0.04%.
Well, let's just say it's about 3,000 votes. Make it easy on us. About 3,000 votes separate these two candidates. What I thought was interesting with these amendments, there only seems to be two of them that are in danger of not passing.
Yep.
Amendment 1 needs that 60%.
Yep.
That Amendment 10 was about 62%. I found it interesting, Amendment 5 had 66% of the vote. That would require a 2/3 supermajority for the state legislature in order to pass at a tax increase. So can you imagine voters voting for Andrew Gillum and for Amendment
and for
5
that.
on the same evening?
Yeah.
And Andrew Gillum wants to increase the corporate tax rate from roughly 5% to 7%. That makes it almost impossible.
Well, I think Amendment 5 completely, if we have a Governor Gillum, I think Amendment 5
No way
completely stops any momentum he would have in getting anything done and passed through the legislature.
And now we see Ron DeSantis is now leading with 49.79%, and Andrew Gillum has 48.99%. Oh gosh, this is going to be like horse racing. It's so exciting. So very interesting. Obviously, these are very early results, and they're obviously going to change. For Attorney General, we have Ashley Moody, the Republican, leading with 52 versus 45 for Sean Shaw. Jimmy Patronis is leading for CFO against Jeremy Rank, who's they were formerly both in the state legislature. Commissioner of Agriculture, that seems to be a very close. Matt Caldwell, he's a state representative from Fort Myers, has a slight lead over Nikki Fried. And now Florida Senate, State Senate District 14. I want to talk about this one because the incumbent, the Republican incumbent, Dorothy Huckel, passed away from cancer just weeks before the election. Her name was still on the ballot, correct? But a vote for her is a vote for Tommy Wright, who was chosen by the Republican Party to replace her. The Democrat, Mel Martin, had been in the race for I want to say over a year, and has been running a very solid campaign. But it seems that this guy who literally jumped in a race a couple of weeks ago is leading with 56% against 43%.
But really, it still was a race against Dorothy Huckel. I mean, not only was Dorothy's name still on the ballot, but when she passed away, people were voting. Mail ballots were, in play or about to be in play. I think the week that she had passed away. And at the end of the day, I was still seeing the yard signs and those things out for Dorothy Huckel because that was the name that people were going to go to the polls. And I know that for those of us who pay attention and we read the news, and certainly, I'll speak for myself, but we love Dorothy. She was a known entity. There are voters out there who might not have even realized she had passed away and that walked into that poll and just saw a name that they recognized. And still pulled the trigger for that. So.
And condolences to her family, and she was definitely a great public servant. But looking out across historically, deceased candidates have actually done very well. Not just here in Florida, we're talking about across the country. Whenever a situation like that happens, candidate dies, they seem to either their progeny, their spouse, or whoever is in their stead ends up winning more times than not.
It was in Missouri just a few years ago, right? There was a senator.
I think in that race, Isadora, a couple of things. One, we'll give a big shout out to Mel Martin. She is one of the best Democratic candidates, I think, in the field this cycle. Smart, sharp, bright, hot on the issues. Good thing, lawyer, former JAG officer, one of the best candidates in the lot, I think, this go around. I certainly condolences, as we said, to Dorothy Huckel's family, and I actually made a call to Mel Martin. I thought she handled the situation very well and appropriately. Wasn't taking advantage. It was a very appropriate response on her behalf. And then last but not least, was a bit surprised to see Tommy Wright as the replacement. There were some big names thrown around in that. I can't tell you why they decided, other than the fact that he was a self-funder. And so there were considerable dollars spent directly and through third parties in that race on his behalf and in Dorothy Huckel's memory. And certainly I think that cash made a difference.
And this is a heavily Republican district. I'm not sure what the voter registration numbers are, but it would have been an uphill battle for any Democrat. And I think Mel Martin is probably, in my opinion, the best Democratic candidate in terms of putting together a campaign, having a message that was pretty centrist, which is she's a progressive, but she defines herself as a pragmatic progressive. I thought that was very interesting, especially in this district. But it seems that that the numbers speak, right? That they still carry a lot of weight.
I want to go back to something Kendall had said earlier. It's true. Democratic Party in Brevard County did a great job of recruiting candidates. We've had too many election cycles where there were uncontested races across the board. So Democrats did a great job of recruiting candidates to run. The one problem, though, I saw, especially in the state house races, was the fact that the Democratic candidates were not able to raise enough resources. For example, Mike Blake and Tyler Soroy. Soroy had $134,000. Mike Blake, $17,000. Randy Fine had over $230,000. Phil Moore had about $20,000. So I think for the Democratic Party to be more competitive, definitely going to need to see more resources raised. But definitely we've seen some candidates recruited and top-tier candidates making these races more competitive, and that's always a good thing.
I think you said it in your prior segment. Amy Tidd referred to it. I mean, you've got to give credit to Stacey Patel and what she's been able to craft and create from a structural standpoint, from a candidate recruiting standpoint, and particularly maintaining, hitting the doors. But Catherine's heard me say it 100 times. I mean, I'm still a believer that you win campaigns on two things: doors and dollars. You hit the doors, and when you can't hit anymore, you've got to find those other methods to communicate, and we all know they're very expensive. And so the fundraising portion of it is something that is always a challenge, but I think if the Democrats continue down that road and keep the same building blocks in place, it'll be a competitive or a more competitive environment than it is today.
And let's go back to the state races. We see Attorney General Republican Ashley Moody leading, but U.S. Senate Rick Scott continues in the lead with 50.07% against Bill Nelson. Still a very close rate. Only, I want to say 7 million votes have been counted so far around that. And now we have Bill Posey leading with 60%. That seems to be very close to the margin that he had 2 years ago, 60% versus 40. And now we have Ron DeSantis leading, very small lead against Andrew Gillum. What's going to make a difference here in the governor's race and the U.S. Senate race in terms of which votes probably have not been counted yet?
Well, I think that goes back to, again, which counties are outstanding, and and we don't have that right now. Of course, you mentioned Pensacola, the Panhandle. One thing is Hurricane Michael. Did that displace voters that may have been more Republican aligned and kept them from voting? That's, I think, a question that we don't know the answer to at this point.
Well, it was also in the primary. It wasn't until the Panhandle started reporting that Gillum surged, that he definitely had a base there that helped him overcome at the end, and that had been a little bit closer. And once the Panhandle started, so it could equally, I think, hurt DeSantis as well as Gillum, if that's where a little bit of his hometown base might have been.
And since I think that we need to stay longer here, this is going to be a very close race, so we're going to extend from 8:30. We're going to stay on air until 9 p.m. because we want to try to get these results in. But I think it's going to be after 9, but we're going to do our best. So stay with us until 9 p.m. So let's go back to the amendments as we wait for the more results in the two major state races.
There's a lot more passing than I thought would. There are a lot more over that 60% mark.
I thought Amendment 1 would have passed already. I think 58%. I mean, obviously, the numbers are going to change, but I thought everybody would vote for a tax break. I wonder why it's not doing as well as I expected.
I think a lot of localities and communities and newspapers were talking about, and as you said, when a budget cycle, begins October 1st, throughout August, September, communities were hearing about, okay, if Amendment 1 passes, this is what the budget might have to look like. And so it became concrete as opposed to theoretical, that if this happens, you might see either cuts or tax increases or whatnot, and it became concrete.
And the interesting is that people assume that they will get a tax break, but when you look, at least Florida Tax Watch had the numbers, only half of Florida homeowners that have a homestead exemption would benefit from this because people think, oh, yeah, my house is worth more than $100,000. It's the assessed value that counts,
right, which is a lot lower,
which is a lot lower, especially if you're a longtime homeowner and you have the Save Our Homes, which caps the increase in the assessed value at 3% or inflation. So a lot of people think $100,000. They're thinking market value, and I think that might have been something that might have confused a few voters. In Brevard County, I think roughly just less than 60% of homeowners who have a homestead exemption would benefit, and then fewer homeowners who get the full tax break, which means your home needs to be assessed at more than $125,000. So again, Brian Lober continues to lead in County Commission District 2 against Victoria Michener, but I want to go back to the amendments. There's so many of them, and we can spend
all night.
All night.
Why
we'll
not?
do a special on amendments.
We didn't get dressed up for nothing.
But I want to talk about Amendment 13, which seems to be doing really well. It bans greyhound racing. We live in Melbourne, or in Brevard County, and we have a dog track in Melbourne. Right. And it seems that they could be losing some of their business.
Looking at that, my only question is, well, what's a greyhound to do?
Well, but
now
to be honest, there's been a real concern over that. I mean, to jump in on his point, but the people from the animal rights community are saying, okay, if this does pass, what are we going to do, or what will the breeders and these people do with all of these dogs? That it kind of phases it out. I don't think it's an immediate ban, so they've got a few years.
2020 is...
But there's a concern of, are we going to find adoption homes, or where will that push be? But to go back to what will that mean to the bottom line of the local track, it actually is often empty. A lot of times there's more dogs on the track than there are people in the seats. That is not their money maker. But a number of years ago, and you might know better than I do, at some point it was, they call it coupled, that you were allowed to have the card games if you had an existing dog or horse track. And so it got coupled. But I think that really at the end of the day, our local MGP will probably still be there, and it might have to reinvent itself a little bit, but this will be what's kind of just referred to as decoupling, that they'll still be able to have the existing table games that they have, and they just no longer have to run the track to an empty stadium.
Maybe Highlight will make a comeback.
Maybe it will.
Right? Who knows? Who would have thought?
And I want one of you guys to explain what highlight is, but I do believe but before that, I do believe we have some local results, if you can show those on the screen. So let's go back. Okay. Kurt Smith is leading with 62%. Again, no surprises here. School board, Misty Belford running against the write-in. So let's stay on District 2 for a second. Cheryl McDougall, 51.9 against Charles Parker, 48.1%. Oh, very, very, very close. It's resembling the governor's race. And in District 5 on the school board, Katie Campbell is leading against Deli Demeraux. And I want to talk about what the school board race, these school board races mean for the county. A few months ago, the school board was contemplating whether to implement STOMP, which would arm some school employees to react against an active shooter. The board decided to table that proposal and instead hire security guards. But Katie Campbell, who is leading in District 5, is for STOMP. Charles Parker, who is trailing in District 2, is also for STOMP. Their opponents are against it. So if Katie and Charles get elected, they can flip the board and potentially bring back STOMP. And again, it would be another vote. I mean, we don't know if they would actually do that, but they would certainly have the votes. And that issue has divided Florida and the nation, especially Brevard. I think we were the only major county or school district that was actively considering arming school employees. I mean, you guys saw the controversy in the town halls. I mean, do you see STOMP coming back, depending on the elections?
I mean, we actually went back to look at this procedurally, the way it was addressed. It does have the opportunity to come back. It is not a dead issue from a procedural standpoint. I think you were correct in terms of the two leaders. Katie Campbell did make it a point in her campaign to say that she was in favor of STOMP, and McDougall went as far to say not only was she not in favor, but being against STOMP was why she decided to run in the first place. And so it's going to be interesting to see those two new perspectives added. But when it does come back, even though we know the sheriff was a big supporter of STOMP, it will now not be STOMP versus nothing. You actually do have armed personnel in the school. So it's going from that to what was proposed by the sheriff if it were to ever come back up again. But I do think you're adding one particular school board member on each side of that issue.
And after the Valentine's Day shooting in Parkland, there was a lot of talk that gun control and the Marshall program would sort of lead voters in these elections. It doesn't seem to me that has materialized. What's your take, Chris?
Well, it's interesting. Gallup polling organization does a lot of polling about these kind of issues. And for March and April of this year, gun control was actually in the top 3 issues. And that was like the first time in maybe 5 years that was the case. But by May, it was back down to number 11 or 12 on the list. So it does seem that we have, we are, once an issue like Parkland happens, there's a lot of concern, but it dissipates very quickly.
So short-term memory here, Catherine, is what's at play where bigger issues such as healthcare taking a bigger importance?
I don't know that any issue takes on bigger importance, but we all have very short attention spans, and unfortunately when things when time goes on and life gets back into your routine, you kind of, the drama of yesterday starts to feel a little bit less dramatic, and you move on, and then, oh, this drama happens, and you move on to that. So I don't think that any one issue is less. Certainly there are people who are motivated and who are turning out. I think it was Amy mentioned earlier, there's a significant number. I have young children, and I can say specifically, there are mothers that never have talked politics in the time that I've known them, that were very engaged this year, and it was over that gun control issue and how and where guns were going to be in our schools. So I do think for those people that's their main issue, they're still motivated. But in terms of the overall electorate and what motivates people on election day, that is always a moving target. And if anything, the last year, I mean, we were talking Me Too, and everyone was thinking, was it like November, December last year? It was the Me Too, and then we had Latvala at the state senate, and what was that going to do? And where are female candidates going to come out of the woodwork? And
I'm glad you didn't mention Brett Kavanaugh.
Lord help us, yeah, we're all. But now, I mean, you head into the election day, and we're back to the, I want to say more base meat. You've got healthcare on one side and immigration on the other. So.
Yeah, and healthcare, a lot of polls show that is the top issue on the minds of voters, and has become a major issue in the governor's race against between Gillum and Ron DeSantis. Chris, you brought it up. Gillum wants to expand Medicaid. Ron DeSantis hasn't really come out with a plan, but he has some smaller reforms that he would like to put in place. But and I was part of the debate that took place in Brevard. And we asked Gillum, I mean, seems that Medicaid expansion is not going to happen if he wins. He has a Republican legislature to work with. The Republicans in the Senate actually supported Medicaid expansion a couple of years ago, but that failed in the House. And they have already said that that's a non-starter. And it seems like Gillum, if elected, is going to have a hard time getting his agenda through the legislature. And then what is he to do after that?
Well, it's a great point. Florida continues to be a holdout against Medicaid expansion. There are actually 4 Republican states that have ballot initiatives on their ballots this evening to expand Medicaid in places like Arkansas and Idaho. So it does seem that there are Republican states that are moving in that direction, but Florida continues to be a holdout on that. And if, with Amendment 5 passing, and a supermajority of the legislature still in Republican hands, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see any kind of Medicaid expansion. But I think the answer to that is more jobs, higher quality jobs that provide health care to their employees is going to be the answer, rather than government subsidized health care.
Ken, though, any hope that Gillum could pull it off if he gets elected?
I think what we continue to hear from the electorate in many counties around the state, they didn't get caught up as much in the how or which particular program, but they did wrap their arms around, if it were not health care for all, for more than are currently provided for today. And I think that was something that people could get their arms wrapped around. They didn't get so much into the specifics because programmatically, procedurally, what the legislature will and won't bear, I think are very problematic as you start to look a little bit down the horizon. But people didn't get caught up in that. It was simply the fact that the issue of health care in its broadest sense was very important to the electorate he was talking to.
And you can't forget in divided government, if Gillum were to win, even though he'd still have a Republican legislature, in Florida he has the line item veto power, and that is when you have divided government, that is a threat that he can hold over them, and it would, as much, it's divided government goes both ways. The Republicans would not be able to get nearly as much done as what they have these last few years when they've had a more cohesive, controlling all 3 of the governor's mansion and the House and Senate. So that will be interesting to see. And certainly that's what's going to happen at the federal level. If, as expected, Democrats take over the House, it's that divided government where some of the quick pace of which legislation can move through, not that anything goes quick anymore in Congress, but the pace at which anything can move will come and significantly slow down.
And let's take a look again at the results for governor and see where we stand. Last time we checked, they were very close. You see Rick Scott and Bill Nelson still neck and neck. DeSantis and Gillum still very close, but now it seems that DeSantis has extended his lead. He's just over 1%. They were a lot closer last time we checked. But again, these results will continue to change overnight, so it's still very, very, very early. But I want to talk about another issue related to this race, which is the FBI investigation in Tallahassee, where Andrew Gillum is the mayor, and these Hamilton tickets that he got from an FBI agent who was posing as a developer trying to do business with the city. Ron DeSantis made a big deal about it. He stayed on message. He brought it up whatever chance he got. I want to hear your take. Given the way that we have become so partisan, do you think that this FBI investigation affects Gillum?
Yes. I mean, from my perspective, you can't at the same time criticize the president for being under investigation and be, and this is, being a Democratic voter or activist, and be outlandish that you have this president that does this, and then the nominee from your party has it, and then try to not make that a deal. It was just by the fact that that was hanging around his neck. As soon as he won the nomination, of course Republicans were going to point that out. That doesn't make it a intellectually sound argument or valid or not, but that was of course going to be then brought up because that exact criticism had been something that Democrats had been beating for so long against the Republican president.
If I may, just let me add, if I could, and that is the mantra was that Andrew Gillum was going to be soft on crime. The murder rate in Tallahassee, we heard that repeated often. He wants to abolish ICE. Then with the FBI investigations and some of the members of his staff involved in this, I think it just played into the narrative that Andrew Gillum was going to be seen as weak on crime and weak on borders, and that's what the Republicans have been hammering him with. But this race is so darn close, I'm not sure that really was a major sell. Kendall?
No, I mean, I would agree. I think, and interestingly enough, I don't practice criminal law, but there was no one to come out and say what the details were about the investigation, because the FBI doesn't necessarily come out and talk or give details, particularly when they are in the midst of an investigation. I think the response he consistently gave was he had been told he was not a target. Right? That may be something that they may say, but he's not getting any additional information, so he really didn't even have anything else to do to allow himself to kind of be exonerated or otherwise. You just have to wait and allow the investigation to play itself out. I mean, clearly DeSantis decided that was going to be a key element as something that he was going to consistently repeat. But I think Chris hit it. The intent wasn't to say you're under investigation. The intent was this whole weak on crime. It was as I've said to some of my good law enforcement buddies, it was more along the fear-mongering side. You should be scared. You could be harmed because he will not be tough on crime. And I think that became the repetitive message. If it were not about the FBI investigations, it was the sheriffs. It was, the variety of people consistently repeating that message.
And let's go back to those results in the governor's race and see how Gillum and Ron DeSantis are doing. See if that has changed. Still the same as last time we checked. Again, a lot more. What do you guys think?
Well, the polls, remember we started talking about the polls, and the polls had Gillum today 4.4 percentage points outside of that margin of error. But right now we see that it is a tight neck and neck race with DeSantis having a slight edge. As with Rick Scott, we see him pulling ahead a little bit here as well.
Very, very interesting. So let's go back to the amendments, and still more to talk about.
So on
there.
the amendments, Amendment 10, the lobbying 6-year ban was up to 78%.
Let's go to Amendment 10
That's
and
crazy.
see those results.
Well, the way it was worded, I mean,
Yeah.
when you read it, who's going to
Well,
be in favor
yeah.
of lobbying, right?
But what it means, though, is that Florida will now have the strongest lobby ban in the nation. And this was one of the...
That was Amendment 12, though. The Amendment 10 we're looking at, that was a fascinating one as
Yeah.
well, about taking away local option for
I'm sorry.
electing county officers like sheriffs and clerks of the court and things of that nature.
Yeah,
But
12,
back to
12
your
was the,
lobbying
12
one,
was
though,
the
yeah.
lobby ban. Yeah,
So-
we'll have the strongest lobby ban because most states that put one in place, it is a 2-year. I think
Right.
a few have a 4-year, but now we'll have a 6-year ban.
Yeah, and that applies to elected officials and people who work in state agencies as well. So that's very interesting. So if you work for the DEP, let's say,
Right.
and then you leave your job, you get to wait 6 years to become a lobbyist. And I agree. Who would vote against lobbying restrictions, and especially in today's how people don't trust government.
The one quote that one of the CRC members had put forward was said, we just think that you should pick. Either you get to be a lobbyist or you get to be an elected official, but you don't get to do both.
Yeah, and I want to look at Amendment 4 because that was an amendment that got attention nationwide. It restores voting rights for felons who have fulfilled their sentences and their probation. It excludes felons convicted of murder, violent, and sexual offenses. Seems to be on pace to get it to being approved. There was a large campaign statewide to pass this, and
it got on by petition, so it had already had that whole year ahead of time of people out campaigning for it just to get the petitions to get on the ballot, and then another 9-10 months of campaigning to support it.
An interesting fact is that the conservative Koch brothers and Ben and Jerry's endorsed this amendment. So I thought it was very interesting. Is getting support from across the aisle. But if Amendment 4 passes, how could this affect elections in the future?
The one thing kind of from a community ground game standpoint is it was sold as something associated with voter suppression. If there was an assumption that individuals with their rights restored could be more likely to vote Democrat, that ultimately this process that's currently in place was being used from a suppressive standpoint. I've always taken this perspective. We're either going to have a restoration system or we're not. We currently have one, but it's not nearly real or reasonable than with 100,000 applications pending, or the amount of time that it takes, or the limited number that the system can actually address on a per annum basis, meant that we really didn't have a clear restoration system. So I think that Amendment 4 is going to have a significant impact, and it's going to turn into a criminal justice related discussion as well as a voting related discussion. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out now that it appears it will pass tonight.
My question, though, on that amendment has just been, do felons make great voters? Why do we have a policy now, because it looks like it's going to pass, where we have a blanket restoration system? In my mind, somebody who holds up a 7-Eleven at gunpoint or trespasses on a construction site should not be held to the same account. But what we're doing here is we are having this blanket wand that we're going to wave to give a restoration of voting rights.
But it does not apply to
Well,
sexual
murderers,
crimes or murder.
Sure, but
Yeah.
it doesn't exclude people though that have committed certain violent acts. Like I said, holding up a 7-Eleven at gunpoint. I think we should have had a system that was rectified by the legislature. As Kendall pointed out, the system we've got now is cumbersome. It's definitely broken. It's unconstitutional, as it's been ruled by a federal judge recently. There should have been a legislative fix, though, in my mind, rather than a constitutional amendment.
Isn't that what's going to be interesting? Because the last times we've had CRC, the first time I don't think any passed, and then the legislature went back and kind of took care of things that they tried to have done through the CRC and didn't. And then the second time we had a CRC, a few more of them passed, but not all of them. And this time, the majority are really going to pass. And these are constitutional amendments. So a lot of these things that we've all been laughing about for the last year, how can they bundle, how can they put this stuff in? Right. This is all now going to be in our Constitution.
You had a very interesting to do, and I thought it would be much larger, where you had people just simply saying, you know what, I may agree or disagree, I just believe it doesn't belong in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And we started to hear that refrain more and more and more as time went along, but it doesn't appear tonight that was a very large group.
That's where I think people will have dropped off. I think when we look at the numbers, and it's hard to tell as they're flipping here, but let's say that we have, X number of million people that vote for our governor, our U.S. Senate race, how many fewer thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, how many fewer people voted in these amendments? Because for everybody that skipped it, rather than pick yes or no, you're just you're empowering a minority of voters then to make these decisions.
Yeah, it'll be in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, going back to the governor's race, DeSantis still maintaining a lead. And I'm looking at RearClearPolitics.com, which is a very reliable source. It shows DeSantis with 50% and Gillen with 48.8%, and I want to say 74% reporting. So seems like Ron DeSantis might be pulling off a win tonight. I mean, 25% is still a lot of votes to.
It
to
depends
be
on where we
being
really
that
need
close.
we need a
Right.
map. We need I don't know if
Exactly.
there's
Where
a
those
site we can
outstanding
pull up,
votes
but
are
where are
calling
those
for it.
outstanding votes? Because until you know where they're at, it's really hard to say if those numbers will.
But
stick.
it is so close right now that it's almost within that mandatory recount. So we definitely got to keep an eye on how things are
What
developing
is that
here.
number? How close?
A half a point.
Half a point.
I did want to go back to Kendall's point, though, and that is, you're right on that. The argument that we shouldn't be loading up our state constitutions with all kinds of policy minutia, it is definitely falling on deaf ears.
Correct.
But I think it's a potent argument. It's just one that's not being received by the voter.
Right.
Well, and each of these had a cookie, as we talked about. Almost all, especially the bundled ones, they had the cookie. They had something that sounds really great. Whether it was needed, necessary, or even relevant to the others made no sense. They had something that sounded great in each of these, hoping that people would vote for that. And then, oh, by the way, that would carry across these other two or three policies.
Amendment 10, it was, to me, is the worst one. And if we can go in and look at the results now, it bundles 1, 2, 3, 4 proposals. And they do different things. It requires the state to have a Department of Veterans Affairs, creates a counterterrorism security office, requires the state legislature to start its annual session in January instead of March during even-numbered years, and it requires that all counties must elect their sheriff, tax collector, and election supervisor and clerk of courts. Makes zero sense. Why are we bundling all of these together?
I love
Like you
that.
said, there's a cookie. For everyone.
The Veterans Affairs Department. I don't know. Do you know anybody who's going along the campaigning on eliminating that office?
No. And that's the thing. We already
would do
have
that?
it. It's just putting it into the Constitution that we must have it. But we already.
Right. And I don't know anybody who would advocate getting rid of it. So that's the hook or the cookie. That draws the voter in. Starting the legislative session in January rather than March. I mean, probably not on the hierarchy of issues that
On
most
the even
people.
years. Yeah.
Right. But actually, there is some merit to that, because when they start later and they get closer to the end of our fiscal year and they haven't passed a budget, then we start to see panic through state agencies and local governments. So perhaps starting it in January, actually there is some merit to that idea.
But they already did do that. They said it through their House and Senate procedure, that it wasn't in the Constitution, that they must start
it has
then.
no business
But they
in the
already did that.
Constitution.
They start later in the odd years, and in the even years they would start earlier, so they'd be done campaigning.
I used to travel to Tallahassee every year to cover session. I liked it when it started in January because I could enjoy the winter, and temperatures dropped to like the low 30s in the morning, so it was nice. I liked it. It was a little bit of winter for me. So I want to look at Amendment 3, which deals with gambling, and it seems to be on pace to pass already at 71% of the votes. Interesting that this is heavily supported by Disney and the Seminole tribe, and it has been sold as giving voters a lot of control over gambling expansion. But when you look deeper into it, actually makes it almost impossible to expand gambling. And you've seen a lot of signs throughout Brevard saying vote no on Amendment 3. Seems that campaign failed. But Ken, I think you've been sort of involved today. Can you explain why this makes it harder to expand gambling?
We were certainly involved. I mean, clearly the funding on the yes side came from Disney and from the Seminoles. Disney potentially articulating more family values, and the Seminoles arguably looking to protect,
They
their
have an agreement with the
control
state,
over gaming.
which they have a virtual monopoly over gambling.
Correct.
In Florida.
In full candor, I happen to be on the other side, and here's the simple no argument. Yes, the yes would create a statewide referendum necessity. On the flip side, Brevard and several other counties have had their own local referendums. Yes, it creates a vote, but for places like Brevard, it would mean that Miami-Dade, Escambia, Duval, Hillsborough, and you name it, would be deciding what would happen in our local area. And so you would lose the local control capacity and capability to decide what happens relative to gaming. Gaming's been a very unique topic in the sense that some people perceive it to be Las Vegas style gaming, and they don't want that type of thing to exist. But primarily on this, you're talking about what exists here in Brevard is a parimutuel facility, happens to be dog racing here, could be highlight or horse racing, that, because of their license, allows them to have a poker room and potentially one day slot machines. But if this were to pass, Brevard will no longer have the ability to control its own destiny. It will be subject to a statewide vote, which would likely put other counties in control.
And this seems very
what happens
expensive
here.
to put on. You would need petitions to get it on the ballot, right?
Correct.
It makes it expensive to gather those. Small facilities such as the Melbourne Greyhound Park.
Correct.
Probably wouldn't have the money to pull off such an endeavor,
Oh, yeah,
right?
you'd have to get 766,000 petitions. You'd have to have them all verified by the
Statewide, not
yeah,
even.
and throughout at least half of the congressional districts. I agree with Kendall 100% here. The fact is that a lot of people believe that Amendment 3 was going to give each county a voice to determine gambling in their own county. They don't realize that folks in Gilchrist County and Hardee County are going to be deciding if we should have a gambling facility at the port or not.
And it actually now, the legislature cannot decide gambling issues. It can only be by statewide referendum in our Constitution. So this basically says that going from here on forward, any gambling decisions will be in our Constitution, and that is the only method of which gambling can be expanded or retracted.
And the legislature has tried to pass a gambling bill, but the House is against basically any expansion of gambling. The Senate is more open, so they're always at an impasse, and then at the end of session, nothing happens. So, but let's go over the amendments again. I want to go to Amendment 9, which bundles two issues that seem very unrelated. It prohibits offshore drilling in Florida and vaping indoors. Obviously, I think the common thread is clean air, but you really have to push hard to establish that connection here. But offshore drilling is a bipartisan issue. Rick Scott has come out against it. I believe even Ron DeSantis has said that he's against offshore drilling. And with a caveat, it applies only to Florida waters. Federally controlled waters obviously will not be affected by this. Right. So important for voters to know. And e-cigarettes, I don't like people vaping next to me, so I don't know about you guys, but
well, I guess that argument was that it was already in the Constitution that smoking cigarettes, so I guess this was a bit of a technology update. This is how people are doing it.
Yeah, I don't think Amendment 9, as far as offshore drilling, is going to have that dramatic of an effect on actual policy. Nothing's really going to change, but we're going to sleep better tonight,
It felt good.
knowing that it's in our Constitution.
So I want to say that all precincts in Brevard County are reporting. So I want to take a look at the final results, and let's start again with Brevard County Commission District 2. Brian Lober wins. In District 4, Kurt Smith, no surprises, heavily Republican district. School Board District 1, Misty Belford obviously pulled off an easy. I want to stay on District 2 for a little bit. Seems that Cheryl McDougall pulled off a very close victory against Charles Parker. Cheryl McDougall moved to Brevard County just over a year ago. She was a social worker. I believe she lived in Colorado. I might be wrong about that.
School psychologist. Yeah.
And Charles Parker, a longtime teacher in Brevard. In District 5, Katie Campbell wins against Kelly Damerow. They were both teachers at some point. Kelly is an attorney. I believe Katie is a substitute teacher. Port Canaveral, Robin won with an impressive victory. In Cape Canaveral, who is the new mayor? That's
Robert Hogue remains.
Robert Hogue.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the incumbent, right, Kendall?
Correct.
City of Cocoa. Interesting, very close race. Jake Williams Jr. wins with 38%. City of Cocoa, the city council, we have Alex Goings with 62% and against Laura J. Houston. Also winning in Cocoa is Lorraine Koss. It seems to be a very easy race. And Skip Williams keeps his seat. He was the incumbent in Cocoa Beach, a long-time incumbent as well, right? Yes. And another city commissioner in Cocoa Beach, Mike Miller, is he the incumbent as well? And can we skip to the referendums in Brevard and see how they did in the end? showing Malabar Town Council. Wow, 193 votes for the winner. That's just surprising. Every vote counts, literally. So that's a good message for voters. So the Cocoa Beach Building Height Charter passes with 53.65% of the vote, and I'm sure developers are very happy. They are going to have some allowance to build, I believe, another 10 feet, right?
Correct.
So, and that has been a fight that has lasted almost 2 decades in Cocoa Beach. And I remember in the beginning they wanted to increase it to 70%, and then this seems to be a sort of a compromise here. In Palm Bay, the economic development referendum passes with nearly 70% of the votes. And also in Palm Bay, now we have the city will be issuing bonds to repair its infrastructure. It won easily with 66%. And we have 5 minutes, and I want to take a look again at the governor results. Obviously, they're not going to change, and unfortunately we're going to have to end our show tonight without knowing the final results. But what is your takeaway of this night? And Chris, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I think Ron DeSantis is definitely performing at a higher level than we had anticipated when the polls closed at 7 o'clock tonight. Rick Scott also seems to be holding his own, so DeSantis and Scott seem to have a slight edge at this point, but again, still a number of votes that have not been counted yet. So again, it's going to be, I think, a long evening before we get to a conclusion.
I don't think anybody's going to go to bed early tonight.
Not tonight.
Especially people who work in the news business. Catherine, what is your takeaway? And let's start with locally.
Locally, I don't know. I think the elevated turnout was wonderful. I think that for our first election, where we did see competitive races in the general election, a number of competitive races, that overall is a good thing for Brevard County. And I think that at the end of the day, voter registration in our inkling, it's still very much a Republican county. And so I would hope, and as we've talked before, that the fact that races panned out exactly as you might think they would, and there weren't many closer races. I think this means there's one Democrat if Cheryl won. That's one Democrat,
and Kenny Johnson.
Kenny Johnson,
and
Alex Goins, and then we did forget one in Lorraine Koss in the city of Cocoa as well. Right.
So there's a few, but the point being that I think it's still very red county. The numbers still came out. Republicans still turned out that a blue wave helped elevate, and there certainly was higher Democratic turnout, but the opposite was also true, that Republicans definitely turned out. And I don't think there really were any surprises because of that, because if you walked into it saying what's going to happen in all these races, a lot of them, they pretty much panned out the way you might think.
We have 1 minute left, but Kendall, what's your takeaway statewide?
Statewide, I think, again, it's going to be a close race, and even though, as Chris talked about, we saw 30 polls, with the exception of the one CNN, there was no runaway train. They were all either within the margin of error or extremely close, and I think we see that playing out tonight. As we get off the air tonight, I think we're all going to go immediately to our phones and computers to see which counties and which precincts are remaining, and I think that's going to tell us the story. If they are Panhandle precincts, it may mean one thing. If they are Miami-Dade precincts, it may mean something completely different.
Right.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. This was great. And I want to thank everyone who's watching. Go to floridatoday.com to check out the results. And tomorrow morning or later tonight, we're going to be posting a podcast with our analysis of the results. I'm Isadora Rangel again with Florida Today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.